Synergetics Livestream 6.0. Today is February 13th, 2021. And today in Synergetics Livestream 6, the spirit is going to be past, present, future, going to be history, mindfulness, and future. History or development is what is in the past of universe and the things that bear upon our system, aka our system. Mindfulness or any other related word is what we have in the moment. So that's what we have access to, and we're going to connect that soon to peripersonal space and some other ideas. And the future is where we're going / where we've been, depending on which way we're looking. So it will be just cool to keep this time crystal past, present, and future perspective as we go through a pretty, hopefully, interesting discussion today. We're going to go over the key memes and themes from Synergetics, as we usually do, and touch upon a new and improved things to integrate. Then today, not just because it's sort of a fun day and a Sunday feeling on a Saturday, all this kind of good energy, we're actually not going to go directly into the Synergetics text, but we're going to cover kind of two adjacent areas that might provide some context on the text. So meta text or meta context. The first part is going to be a shorter discussion of Bucky, the philosopher Wittgenstein, and ants. And then the second part, which was pretty fun to make, and I kind of had to just shut it down to get to this stream, but it's really just the beginning of hopefully a fun direction of research, is looking at some of the parallels between Bucky and Synergetics and William Blake, the poet. Let's go to key memes and themes. Many coats of paint, lots of ways to understand Synergetics, and lots of pieces to it. We're always thinking about what the best way is to reorder it and distill and zoom in versus zoom out on different parts of it. Which parts are axiomatic or grounding for one another? Where's their tension and compression within Synergetics itself? Synergetics is relational and multi-scale thinking. We're going to always be talking about how things are related to each other, the space they include, and then also inherently these kinds of systems are both physical, metaphysical, and across scales or levels. Synergetics is connected to our directly accessible experience through tangible models, like these cool TETs that I have here, but also through thought experiments and sort of pathways that lead somebody towards a certain kind of thought, guiding them around the dynamics that they're already engaging in. Synergetics doesn't have any infinitesimals or put as much of a focus on points, lines, and planes. And so we talked a lot last time about how you could call the tetrahedron a four-faced shape, which is kind of the look you get at when you have this filled in tet. You might want to call it a six-edger. Maybe there are other six edgers, maybe not, but this one, the wireframe, makes you think about six edges. And you can also call it a tetravert for vertices. It's the smallest space enclosing arrangement of so-called points. But in Synergetics, we kind of think about it as a univol. And we're going to return to tetrahedra, especially in the context of Blake, in just a little bit. For Bucky and Synergetics, design is anticipatory. It's like designing a ramp before you need to use it, or before any specific use case arises. That's anticipation. And that's what ties design as an art and science and practice and tradition to Synergetics' approach to cybernetics, which is about navigation and guided systems. Tensegrity is sort of the applied branch or the physical branch of tension and compression, whereas Synergetics is a bit more abstracted and metaphysical. Similarly, engineering is like the more applied and pragmatic branch of physics, which can veer into the mathematical, geometric, etc. One theme that we're going to return a lot to is that space has a shape. And it's a question, what shape is it? If you think it has a shape, or multiple shapes, or something like that, what are those shapes? Are they cubic? Are they tetrahedral? Are they something else? And although sometimes we're talking about so-called static entities, like these things, people would say they're static or they're inert, but they're actually persisting through time, and they're a dynamical process. The metal molecules that now make up this TET transiently were put together by a certain process, and they're going to dissolve by another process on a different time scale. So just like living systems, inert systems are still part of the dynamic stability of patterns that find themselves to be reproducible through, quote, time. We talked about universe as the total scenario. The total setup is universe. It's the biggest one, and so we don't even need to say the universe. It's just universe. And whenever we're talking about system, we're talking about a subsystem within universe. And we start with universe and then zoom into system, discarding irrelevancies, not trying to build up in a realist sense the neck bones connected to the knee bone, etc. And 4D and the number 4 is going to come up a lot. Also, D is the fourth letter. And this is going to return in just a few slides when looking at Kirby's recent excursions into Wittgenstein and parables related to the trims and the normals. But 4D means that we think about tetrahedrons as having priority over squares, or at least having a more primacy. And then there's other definitions of 4D. The top definition is related to extended geometry. The middle definition is related to physics and quantum mechanics. The bottom definition is purely synergetic. It's related to the tet as the minimum shape. You could also talk about computer science. We rearranged the things to integrate slide, and we have a couple questions that people can always submit and ask more, like what would be something cool just to put up here and keep in mind. What was Bucky's intention? What are our intentions? What are the connections to symmetry and E8 groups, maybe? We're going to talk about symmetry with Blake's section. And how can we participate in modern synergetic efforts, either implicitly or explicitly? And then we have topics to include section. So thanks, Daja, for suggesting to discuss Hakon's synergetics. It's something that will come up a little bit today, but could deserves a lot of time. So thanks again for the suggestion. And some sections of the text to read. And then, of course, always trying to learn more about the formalisms and the way that modern formalisms play out with computers. All right. Here we go to the first section on Bucky, Wittgenstein, and ants. There's going to be kind of two pillars or connectors between these three ideas. So here's a young Buck. Here's Ludwig Wittgenstein, allegedly, the philosopher. And here are some ants that I painted in Arizona during graduate school with the blue and the yellow painted ants. And connecting in this corner, connecting Bucky and Wittgenstein will be Kirby Erner, in a diptych, a dyad of blog posts. And in this corner, connecting Wittgenstein to ants and also the observer and the way that that implements out in science will be my PhD advisor, Professor Deborah Gordon, from 1992. So let's read some quotes from Kirby's Wittgenstein essay, which is starting with one foot in the Bucky land, as Kirby always does, implicitly or explicitly there as well, and thinking about, with a view towards Wittgenstein, what is something interesting about this philosopher. So I'm not super familiar with a ton of the work. Obviously, I've not read in the original text copiously or anything like that. So drawing more off of Kirby's distillation and where it took me when thinking about it today, rather than trying to be auto trying to learn some super specific details about Wittgenstein, just as a disclaimer, just random thoughts, speculation as always. So Kirby writes, in the same way that horse points to a horse, so must curiosity point to some internal mental process, of which we imagine becoming subjectively aware through introspection. And maybe someday, goes the thinking, we'll objectively observe the very mental process on a brain scan of some kind, once the science gets better. So this is Kirby kind of steelmanning or putting up a resonatable version of a fallacy that actually Wittgenstein is going to seek to correct. The fallacy that Wittgenstein was almost preempting, portenting, would be that we could identify a given mental process and then maybe eventually reduce it down to something that was neuromolecular. And in synergetics, the way this distinction arises is the difference between what is physical and what is metaphysical. So here we can say this is a tetrahedra, and people kind of get it. That's the best way to describe this shape. It's the best compression, but we're not talking about it being the size-free idea of a tetrahedron, which is metaphysical according to synergetics, because it's size independent. It doesn't get instantiated by physical things. Like triangle is an idea. You can't have a triangle in the real world, even if it's three pieces of metal that are shaped like a triangle. Again, you could call it a triangle, but it's made up of little other structures down below. When I say that crow is curious about what's in my garbage gutter, I'm not extrapolating from my own experience of observing curiosity as a mental process to some dubious claim about the mental state of the crow. I'm telling a story about a crow pecking away at the detritus in my gutter, hoping for edibles. Again, hoping refers to no brain chemistry inside the crow. So it's really a nice point. It's that when we're seeing the crow pick around and search around, we're thinking it's a compression for us in terms of our understanding and our communication about real things in the world. We're not hypothesizing a mapping between neural states and what the crow is doing when we say the crow is acting curiously. Because that's kind of taking on all of this baggage of neuromolecular reductionism and, oh, well, surely that curiosity is a neural state. Is it? Is it really that obvious? And it's really not. And we're not going to go into it too much in detail here. But when we talk about non-self systems, so non-phenomenologically accessible experiences, maybe even those two, we're telling stories that involve symbolic language. And words and styles of communication always come along with their implicit baggage. So Kirby writes, Wittgenstein was suggesting we would be able to follow his example by carrying out these investigations on our own, into the concept of race, for example, once we were free of certain deeply entrenched biases about how language must relate to the world. So I don't know about being free of deeply entrenched biases, but I know that studying how language must relate and does relate to the world is pretty useful. If we want to be an effective investigator slash forager, or a cosmic fisher, as Bucky might say, we're going to have to use our glimpses of our perspective to navigate effectively on a landscape that transcends perspective. So imagine if someone said, well, I think that we should turn left or turn right at this upcoming junction, keep it neutral or go straight. And someone says, well, that's just your perspective in this car going this fast, looking out through the window. And you say, yep, exactly. It's exactly my perspective. So just because things are perspectival doesn't devalue them. In fact, we should actually go deeper into the way that our thought and our language communication is coexistent with how we view the world and the affordances around us. Let's go a little deeper into this post with URL on the bottom by Kirby called A Philosophical Investigation in the Wittgensteinian Tradition. So previously he had his Wittgenstein Explained in 2019. And this one was pointing to this idea. Not the only idea, certainly, that Wittgenstein broached, but this is sort of taking a new tack. And he also unpacked it a bit in his YouTube video. So there's two groups of people in this story. There's the trims, and the trims are those who multiply tetrahedrally, maybe pun intended, and they are visited upon by the orthonormals, or just the normals, riding upon the HMS orthodoxy. I mean, whose orthodoxy, right? Or is there an HMS orthopraxis or heteroprax? And the orthonormals are those who have a pi over 2 radian or a 90-degree inclination. So we can look at kind of a 2 by 2. It's kind of like a Punnett square, but it looks really nice here. We have area and volume. And on both area and volume, the trims differ significantly. So the trims on area, the way that they count and calculate area is because they're downstream of taking this 60-degree angle. I'm just going to use the degrees instead of the radians. Because they're downstream of the 60, the way that they actually do multiplication of area, like the way that we would do it with a triangle in Euclid world, would be like base times height times 1/2. People learned that early. But in trim world, what they do is they actually draw out a tetrahedron. Here's 6 times 12, 6 times 2. It's 6 across, and then it's 2 tall, and then you just fill in the green, and that's what you get. So they have a different way that also works to multiply. So if someone says, I mean, come on, how can squares not describe reality? Because here's a 10 by 10 inch piece of wood, length by width, and I needed 100 units of paint to cover it. So how can 10 times 10 not equals 10 times 10 equals 100? And it turns out there's multiple ways to multiply. And it's just about what kind of thing you're trying to explain. And then with respect to volume, the normals have a unit cube. So this is like the SI cube. So 1 centimeter on each side. It's 1 gram of water. It takes 1 Celsius to heat it up by this and that much. And everything is unified around the cube and its 90-degree angles. Last time we talked about the parable with Bucky in the classroom and how cubes don't exist and all this stuff. But the trims take a tet first approach. So this has a weight of 1, so to speak. If this were going to be, rather than a cube with a centimeter of 1, if we had a tet with an edge length of 1, quote, centimeter, then it would be rescaled so that everything would just be like 50% more. And so it would kind of still work out, whatever it would happen to be. In fact, we'll see what number it would be soon. So Kirby's thought questions arising from his piece: who's right? Does it matter who's right? What gives rise to civilizational conflict? Not just interpersonal conflict, but recurrent wet markets for civilizational conflict and individual conflict together, different scales. How do they influence each other? How are we going to co-design and enact a world that works for everyone? And in Bucky's words, how will we emerge through ongoing emergency? Here's a little bit deeper just because it is a synergetic stream. So to go one more layer into geometry with a quote and some images from Kirby's piece. The normals said no way, but their grip on power had faded in the interim, and some of the old trim knowledge was seeping through, including right here on medium. I guess which side he's on. Want a fast way to compute the volume of any tetrahedron, regular or not, in tetra volumes? Just input the 6 edges starting from any apex and then going around the opposite base. So here it is laid out as a shape perspective, and then here is a Python version of an algorithm. So although Bucky didn't have access to Python, probably, we can think about how to adapt geometry into the computational setting. That's one piece that comes out of it. And another piece that comes out is sometimes there's patterns that are kind of like the tilt shift. Like we talked about last time, how when you're looking at the tet out of face, all you can see is a triangle, and you wouldn't even know that it had depth. And then you rotate it by just a couple of degrees, and all of a sudden you can see 3 faces, but never the 4th one. And you can see actually all 6 of the edges. And you can also see depth if you have 2 eyes to see because of the sides. So a little tilt shift sometimes reveals a lot of difference. And so it turns out that when we think about the volume of shapes and how shapes are related to each other, a little tilt shift in our perspective allows us to think about these basic shapes, the tet, the cube, and then these two, which we're not going to go into, but they, depending on how you rescale them, have really nice integer level volumes. So Bucky was moving away from irrational numbers and infinitely extending numbers and just wanted things to be kind of minute and particular, to use a Blakeism. So when you go the synergetics route, like the trims did and do, you're going to get this canonical integer volumetric ratio. Maybe it doesn't matter that much. Maybe it does. And also, there's all kinds of cool things related to multiplication and exponentials, close packing of spheres. So that's what synergetics has to do with geometry, but also in this Wittgensteinian tradition that Kirby is introducing. So let's take a little hinge on Wittgenstein and go to this 1992 paper by Professor Deborah Gordon called Wittgenstein and Ant Watching. So here in January of 1992, I was a fetus, and then here I am collecting ants/ant watching in Arizona, working for Deborah. So the abstract of what Deborah wrote. This is coming from a behavioral ecology and just observer's perspective and a scientist's perspective. Research in animal behavior begins by identifying what animals are doing. In the course of observation, the observer comes to see animals as performing a particular activity. How does this process work? How can we be certain that the behavior is identified correctly? Wittgenstein offers an approach to these questions looking at the uses of certainty rather than attempting to find rules that guarantee it. Here, 2 stages in research are distinguished. First, watching animals, and second, reporting the results to other scientists. Certainty about what the animals are doing has different uses at each stage. This is really deep, and it characterizes this openness of observation in the field, to being open to seeing what the animals is, quote, actually doing, and not pre-categorizing as if you were ready to communicate it. It'd be like if somebody were looking at 2 streams of ants on the ground and somebody said, what are they doing, or what's happening here? And the other person said, that's not publishable. Some people talk like that. It's unfortunate because they're thinking and it's projecting through their perspective on the world as if that were the measure, where this emulation in a virtual machine internally of what the reviewer 2 says or of what science, quote, needs. And what Deborah is pointing to here is a separation in this Wittgensteinian fashion between the uses of certainty versus the rules of certainty. And so here's an example of where that is a lot like Bayesian statistics. It's not like, when are we going to have 100% confidence on this? From a realist perspective, you may never get to 100%. You're never going to have a p-value of 0. You might have one that's below 0.05, but you're not going to have 0. Or you might have a Bayes factor of 50,000, but you're not going to have one of infinity because it's a number over a number. And so you might have enough confidence or certainty in able to act, communicate, publish, etc., without coming down overly hard on actually what is and on our perspective on what is, which actually hampers our broader pursuits. So she relates a story about watching foragers. And already when we say that ant is foraging, it's already saying what it is and giving it a kind. That means it's not a forager, and it's not a nurse, unless you say that nurses and foragers are overlapping. And something in ant science that comes up all the time is people talk about foragers, but they just observed it foraging. So what's the difference between thinking about the foraging nestmate and the forager nestmate? It's identity. Is a firefighter 24/7, even if they're not working, are they a firefighter? Or are they a politician? Or are they a doctor? Whatever it happens to be, is our identity what we do? How does that play out in human society where we actually assign long-lived roles? And Deborah writes, I came to see the confused foragers as patrollers, searching for new food. I saw the other foragers as already decided about their destinations, not available to be distracted by a new source of food. So one way of talking about ants is, they're all wanting to go back and forth to the food, and so why are these ones lost? There's a lot of projection there, because actually it's like this collective process where if never an ant diverges from a trail, there's never going to be discovery of new resource. And so rather than projecting and a double projection of what something is doing and then projecting an error on top of that, we can actually take a step back and go, okay, we're seeing that 95 of these past 100 ants did walk straight, but 5 of them undertook seemingly a different trajectory, like a categorically different trajectory. That's really interesting, and that's about being open-minded and not pre-categorizing semantically or linguistically. And here's the last paragraph of the paper. My questions about ant watching do not arise when I am watching ants. Most of the time, I do not think much about certainty when ant watching. I enact it. Early enactivism. Extremely early enactivism. The questions do not come from doubts about the certainty of my seeing, but from the ways that doubts about the certainty of seeing have shaped scientific practice. The resolution of the problem would come from changes that would allow observers to talk about what they are actually doing when watching animals. Truthful accounts of scientific animal watching don't yet exist. This truth is not yet formed because we have not yet learned to talk about it. So she brings it back to communication and conceptual understanding. And in the journal club courses, mainly for undergrads, that I had taken with Deborah, this was how we sometimes read the animal behavior. The title of the paper would be aversive behavior in this animal, or mate guarding behavior in that animal, aggression here, sexuality here. And we would always go to the paper and look at the methods section, say, okay, well, what did they measure in the ostrich? Okay, they did a scan every 30 seconds, and then it was whether the head was up or head was down. Or, okay, they were looking at the squirrel for this video length of time, and they had it in this context. And a lot of the times when you actually get into the details and search for the details about what was actually observed, they don't even define it in the paper, even for very well-known papers. Certainly there's a movement towards increased reproducibility in science. It's a great thing, but this is even more fundamental. This is about the way in which we predetermine what is to be measured, observed, categorized, etc. This is also expanded in a really powerful book by Professor Helen Longino on aggression and sexuality, I think in 2013. Let's go a few more last thoughts. How are ants related to synergetics? How are they not related to synergetics? How is the ant investigator, like Professor Gordon here, like the synergetics student or practitioner and or teacher? We're all learning by doing, and we're all engaged in hopefully mission-oriented service, and we're on our trim tab flotilla together. So pretty cool how sometimes an unexpected connection, like Kirby writing about Wittgenstein, it can connect out to so many other areas like evolutionary ecology and ants. And here, just on one more general note before we go to the Blake Bucky head up, this is just a cool paper that I came across from 2005 in a book called Fractals, Applied Synergetics, and Structure Design. And this is not Bucky's Synergetics, down here on the bottom right. Hakan, Synergetics, 1985. Ivanova, Synergetics and Fractals, 94. Synergetics, the Self-Organization Theory. Synergetics World Vision, Regimes with Intensification, Self-Organization Science. So Synergetics does not, to everybody, invoke Bucky, Fuller. Many people actually associate it more with this other branch of research in self-organization and complexity. Now, I also like that area of research too, so it's pretty interesting to see how these ideas are being woven together. And then, in a triple twist of fate, this paper in Applied Synergetics 2005 starts with a header quotation from Blake, one of his most famous poems, or sections of a poem. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Related to The Doors of Perception, of course, by Aldous Huxley, and psychedelics and a lot of other things. So what is this paper about that connects the other synergetics to Blake, and what is happening here with complexity? So the abstract is, take it or leave it, you can agree or disagree with the authors. It is shown that the realization of the anthropic cosmological principle, so just pause there, that means that things were basically set up in a way that is anthropocentric. It's all about humans, the weak anthropological, of course, but the weak anthropological principle or fallacy, depending on which side you are, is like the physics of the reality are set up in a way where, of course, we had to observe it. Like, given that we're observing, you couldn't have had the Earth in a different region of phase space and temperature, or you couldn't have had a physical constant be different, because then you wouldn't be there to think about it. So whenever someone says, if the Earth were moved just 100 feet this way, then we would die. Well, either we would be different, quote, whatever that means, or it wouldn't exist to have perceptive entities. So it's kind of an irrelevancy. So that's the weak anthropic principle. And then the strong anthropic principle or fallacy is that things were created for us, or even solipsistically for one's self. And or maybe even somewhere between humanistically and solipsistically is that things were created for one group of people or some belief system of people. And whether it's a principle or a fallacy is just up to the observer. But that's what this observer, Sergei Timosheev, has realized. And a dynamic unity of all entity in the universe, as well as novel discoveries in astrophysics. The proof of cosmological distance to the gamma ray bursts, detection of anomalies in the energy release at supernova 1A explosions in distant galaxies, form not only the scientific proof of the transcendence of the world, but also create a basis for potential readiness to a new dialogue with nature. A methodological ground of this dialogue could become formed today by the science of complexity. Pretty cool, because interesting to think about complexity as this dialogue with nature. According to modern, quote, representations on dynamics of complex systems and theory of the deterministic chaos, in chaos of a temporal variable, so like v of t, so some temporal function, something that's dynamic, changing through time, v of t, and spatial h of x, so x is a coordinate, so we have t and x, place and time, where, and when, and then v and h are two functions that change how things are in space and time, SPM, where you at. Variations of measured dynamical variables. Exists a defined order connected to display of a self-similarity in dynamics and structure of natural systems at different levels of hierarchy in their existential organization. So kind of like saying space and time are little space within within bigger spaces, and little time within bigger time, nesting. As a result, but there's renormalization groups, and there's sort of coarse graining, downward entropy, causal entropy, abstraction, generalization. As a result of this phenomenon, effective number of dynamic variables describing a behavior of complex natural system is not too large. So if you go into every molecule of the body, you're going to have a big model. It's going to be a big vector in R for you. But if you say, I care about explaining 80% of the variation in whether the person is walking or not, and it's going to be a single variable called, are they asleep or not? You don't even need to go into the REM sleep and things like that, except for exceptions that prove the rule, like sleepwalking. But you can explain a huge amount of the variability, aka be an effective navigator, with simple models for complex systems. That's what complexity is all about. Just this circumstance opens the possibility to understand the language of nature and conduct a dialogue with nature. So this is thinking about language and dialogue, communication as symbol interfacing and information exchange of symbolic types. And so if we're essentially semantically, if not symbolically, exchanging information with nature, then why not lean into it with complexity science? So where does Bucky's synergetics fit into transcending the world? Where does Wittgenstein fit into transcending the world? Where do the ants of the world fit into this? But it's pretty interesting because transcendentalism is in Bucky's roots and culture with his family and his intellectual kin as well. The American transcendentalism and American pragmatism, as well as so many other knowledge traditions. And so just to see in the 21st century, in a book about a related synonym of synergetics, to see so many things come together is pretty fun. So nice finding. All right. This prepares us to go to our second section on Bucky and Blake. All right. So good. About half an hour for that first section, because this one might be more than half an hour. We'll see. Let's just go to it. So for these comparisons, William Blake's going to be in blue on the left and Bucky Fuller's going to be in red on the right. Just any resemblance to any, patterns that people have, purely coincidental. So just truly a layout decision. In the case of William Blake, he was born in 1757 in England. Bucky was born a little bit more than 100 years later in 1895 in New England. So using a little bit of genealogy research, I found that Bucky was the second cousin 8 times removed to Admiral Robert Blake, the father of the Royal Navy. So yeah, in the grandest sense, everybody's related to everybody. We're all human. And is it possible that Bucky and Blake are related more closer than that? I would leave it to another genealogist, but seems like somehow the Blakes and the Fullers and the previous different generations, Bucky's matriline, were probably related. So what about the lives of these two very interesting fellows who we're going to be talking about for the next little bit? Well, here's an engraving or a painting, etching or something by Blake. And Blake was married to his wife, Catherine, in 1782 when Blake was 25, and they had a lifelong relationship. Bucky was married with Anne Hewlett in 1917 when he was 22, and that was also a lifelong marriage and relationship. And quoting from this, I don't have the source down here, but here was a quote I found about the two Blakes and their life. The Blakes' strange leisure activities live on through an anecdote told by Blake's friend Thomas Butts. There's some great in this book. There's some great letters with Mr. Butts. When he came to visit the Blakes in their small summer home at Lambeth, Butts was stunned to see the Blakes completely naked. But Blake was unfazed. "Come in," Blake purportedly cried. "It's only Adam and Eve, you know." The Blakes were simply reciting Paradise Lost in character. So Blake wrote a poem called Milton and was big student and scholar of Milton, so was doing a reenactment with his wife. And then in the eulogy for Anne, I think in the New York Times, this was one quote. Mr. Fuller once observed, "When two people as diametrically different as Anne and I get married, it either cracks up right away or it turns out to be fantastically good, the way it has been for us." So that's kind of a cute Valentine's Day story about Blake and Bucky, but that's really just setting the stage to talk more about their life and work. So on the left side, these are both images by Blake. Blake saw the science of Newton and Bacon, and he just throws out all these names and just lists them off. He's just like, you and you and you. Saw the science of Newton et al. As incomplete for understanding geometry, theology, psychology, etc. And this is Newton, one of Blake's most famous works. And Fuller saw the geometry of Euclid as incomplete for understanding science, theology, psychology, etc. So we've talked about how Bucky thought that the flat plane lended itself to the 90-degree thinking, the non-intersecting parallels, which of course doesn't happen on any sphere, no matter how large. So if we're in a sphere or on a sphere, then you probably want the one that doesn't violate that one most fundamental piece, to say nothing of preferring the tet over the cube. But they both looked at the mechanical and the geometric physics and saw something to build upon, but didn't just say, oh, that's not the case, or that doesn't lead to useful outcomes. It was more like they had something to reinterpret rather than just to reject. That being said, they both had radical and unconventional interpretations of numerology, sacred geometry, spirituality, science, religion, society, art, bunch of other stuff. A lot of similarities in that. This is a citation to the paper about Blake's Newton, and then this is from a very interesting blog post from actually just a couple of days ago, February 7th, 2021, Fearful Symmetry, William Blake and Sacred Geometry by Rob Tweedy, under the name Golgonooza, which is not Google, but actually Blake's, one of his mythical locations. So this is just one interesting piece, is that whether you think of Bucky as an engineer or a scientist or as even a literature artist, as some do, and whether you think of Blake as a visual artist and or a poet or a visionary or a politician, and whatever you want to think about him as, they both had a deep understanding and respect for, look at these 90-degree angles, for the world that the machines had brought, and that the some of the outcomes of these earlier Greek as well as other cultures and many, many antecedents to their current ability to stand on the shoulders of giants and do what they did, because they were visionary. So here is where there's some interesting parallels. For Blake, well, let's just start with Bucky, because this is the Synergetics stream, so I would expect most people have more familiarity or interest in Synergetics, so spend a little bit more time on Blake than Bucky on most of these slides. So for Bucky, everything's about the tet, fourfold tet, tetra, tet. The minimum system is unity through fourfoldness. 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1. 4 vertices, univol. Tetrahedron, univol. So the tetrahedron is unity. You do have his quote, minimum unity is multiplicity, and at minimum 2, or however that one goes, but it's pretty clear that it's not a yin-yang philosophy. It's actually a fourfold philosophy. So just to clarify that there are positive and negative, there's tension compression, there's duality, but actually duality arises as a special case of the way the tetrahedron is aligned. What about Blake? Well, Blake has a vast mythology and theology, which basically I'm not the one to go into, and it's not going to happen today, but Albion is his name for this fourfold cosmic man, and this fourfold Albion is also, it's used across multiple levels to refer to a body of a person with anatomy, but also to the nation that Blake was in England, and also to the world more broadly. So it's this sort of fractal fourfoldness that Bucky had with Albion. Here's one citation on that, 2011. And then also the 4 Zoas were these works, and the Zoas are like archetypes, and there's been a lot of research on the Jungian archetypes and Blakean Zoas, and this is this whole mythology, Luva, Urethona, Urizen, and some of them have little funny names like Urizen or Urizen. It's like your reason is sort of the archetype of reason, and Urethona is like earth or you are, so it's like kind of text message speak in a weird way. Luvah, lava, pretty interesting. And then also, I don't think I'm gonna, well, let me just go onto this other computer briefly to just get one thing accessible. But this image is showing the overlap of the 4 Zoas with Adam, kind of the positive principle, and Satan, sort of this fiery negative principle. And Bucky is not using these names, so these are concordances, they're not parallelisms, but it's pretty interesting that Blake has a fourfold system that has a plus and a minus. It's kind of like how there's the 2 degrees of freedom, like in Fuller Explanation. Edmondson talks a lot about it. It's like Euler's formula plus 2. And so why is there that plus 2 left over? And that's like a polarity switch. There's a bunch of related pieces in Synergetics, so that's pretty interesting. Then Blake talks about fourfold vision. So here's a citation of O'Gorman called The Fourfold Visions of William Blake and Martin Heidegger. So I was like, okay, I already went with one name I can't pronounce from philosophy I barely know with Wittgenstein. Probably not going to double dip with Heidegger, but I'm sure that's a really fascinating avenue of research. But we can look at this other piece that's with somebody also we won't go into, but the introductory section is explanatory. Thomas Boston. Blake, Thomas Boston, and the Fourfold Vision by David Groves. And then I'll bring something onto the screen here. All right, there we go. So the word fourfold, or fourfold with a hyphen, appears many times in Blake's longer poems and is clearly one of his favorite expressions. Probably the best known example occurs in his letter to Thomas Butts. The letters to Mr. Butts, they're so important. Blake wrote, "Now I a fourfold vision see, and a fourfold vision is given to me. 'Tis fourfold in my supreme delight, and threefold in soft Belua's night, and twofold always may God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." So, wow. Here is Newton with his single vision, Euclidean geometry. Single vision. That's the one that you don't want. He's saying that's Newton's sleep. It's actually related to Sri Aurobindo's The Sleep of Knowledge. You can fall asleep when you have a projection of the world and you think that there's knowledge and it's fallacious. It's actually being asleep. So he's praying, saying anything but Newton's singular vision. And then twofold always, Adam and Satan, plus and minus, yin yang, tension compression, Bucky. Threefold in soft Belua's night. Now, we could speculate where Belua maps onto Synergetics, but let's recall from this page that there's the one volume, and then the cube has 3 times the volume of a tet. So, it's almost like there's a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4. But fourfold is the supreme delight, and that's his favorite, and that's his vision. So it's almost like seeing all 4 sides of the tet is the supreme delight. Then, threefold in soft Belua's night. So then, when you see threefold, you see 3 faces of the tet. Twofold always, because that's looking actually at the as above, so below shape, the Ethereum shape. And then from single vision is the single perspective. So even with the tet, just visually, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Just like he kind of lays out. All right, then let's look at this other quote. This is the closing quote from Groves' essay. In the introduction to his book, Hermeneutics, The Logic of Invention, Greg Ulmer suggests that he is trying to invent a new mode of academic discourse the way Breton invented surrealism, or the way Plato invented dialectics, to do with Jacques Derrida what Breton did with Freud, or to do with Plato what Plato did with Socrates. I guess the final question here is this: is it possible to invent a new mode of academic discourse by doing with Blake what Blake did with Milton? Wow. A lot of metaphor and meta-metaphor here. But basically, Groves is getting at this idea that Plato invented a field of dialectics through discourse with Socrates, real or imagined. And Breton invented surrealism with real or imagined discourse with maybe Derrida and Freud. And so he's saying, can we actually scaffold and build in this nonlinear way, next generational way, by doing with Blake what Blake did with Milton? And what Blake did with Milton was he quoted him basically, it's not enough time to go into it here, but his poem Milton and his understanding of who Milton was is pretty fascinating, and they have discussions in his work, and he speaks for him, and there's a whole poem Milton that's like very long and one of the lesser accessible ones. But in a way, I'd say, is it possible to invent a new mode of academic discourse? Academic? No, maybe. Hard to say, given academia. That's the reality. Intellectual, absolutely. So will there be a new mode of discourse by doing with Blake what Blake did with Milton? Yes. And anybody who wants to can make it happen. Let's do it together. But will it be in academia is probably a question to be resolved later. So one more piece here before we go to the bottom piece is, while researching this, I found I think a PhD dissertation by Teresa Cunningham of West Virginia University. And the dissertation was called William Blake's Artificial Mythology and Quotations from World Mythos. So this is almost doing the work of the perennial philosophy like Huxley, Doors of Perception, Blake, and looking at the similarities and differences with different world knowledge traditions. So it's pretty cool just to look at what Dr. Cunningham here did with the table of contents. I did skim through this, but found that the most clear representation was the table of contents, unsurprisingly. Because Blake's system of myth is extremely extensive. And if anyone is aware of like a knowledge management system or a knowledge network of Blake's system with the Zoas and Albion, I would love to be in contact, because I think it's a great, it'd be a great thing to have, like a knowledge management system that was able to annotate with hypertext what Blake wrote to scaffold a better understanding of his myth. And whether it's artificial or whether that word carries negative connotation is a little secondary. But Cunningham talks about Blake's interpretation of the Eastern traditions as well as some of the Abrahamic traditions. Albion, Vishnu, and Garuda, extremely interesting, two of Hindu associated things with Albion, which is the cosmic man from Blake's perspective. And then a case study in chapter 3 on the book of Job, which is pretty cool too. So, interesting dissertation. And we can conclude this slide with actually another fourfold English fellow. What is it with the Force? That's a great question. And that is Carl Friston, who is a professor at UCL in London, where Blake was born. And Friston works on something called the free energy principle and active inference. You can check out activeinference.org if you want to learn about the active inference lab. But for here, all we'll need to say is that there's basically a fourfold minimal system. It's extremely tetrahedral in active inference stream 12. Right at the stroke of midnight of 2020, I talked about synergetics and active inference, but there are four kinds of things. There's internal and external states, and then there's sense and action across an interface. So all three of these are getting towards this fourfoldness of the total system, but we don't get four. Let's even think about Blake's poem in light of the Markov blanket and the interface and the generative model here. Fourfold vision is when you see the whole system. That's like when you have the total model in front of you. That's supreme. Threefold is when you have access to the internal states and the blanket states, sense and action. That is soft blue as night. What does it mean? I don't know. But that's threefold. That's as good as it gets, because the external states are hidden states. If we knew that, it would be supreme. Maybe it is that way. But in blue as night, in the sleep of awareness, we have access to three here: sensory, active, and internal, not external, another person's mind. Twofold, always. It's always about internal, external, always about sense and action. Duality of dualities. Sense, action across the interface, internal and external, the symmetry. And then single vision is Newton's sleep. If you have sense without action, or if you have, you're ineffectual in the world. If you can act, but you can't sense, it's senseless. If you have no internal state, there's nothing's there. So single vision is Newton's sleep. I don't know what Carl knows about Bucky Fuller or William Blake, but Carl, if you ever listen or hear about this, I would be really curious to hear your thoughts on Blake and Bucky. All right, let's continue down this concordance trek. So Blake and Bucky, they have the same caption here because both of them are obsessed with seeing the hidden symmetries in thought, history, biology, and really everything. Blake went about it one way and Bucky went about it a different way. Many people would say, oh, well, Bucky, I mean, symmetry, of course, the tet and all the kinds of symmetry. And it was even one of our things to integrate was thinking about synergetics and symmetry. However, more people may have actually heard of Blake with relationship to symmetry because he has written one of the most famous poems related to symmetry. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? And that quote, fearful symmetry, has been used by many authors. This is it as a one of Blake's drawings. A.Z., great name, has written a book called Fearful Symmetry, The Search for Beauty in Modern Physics, which is very related to Murray Gell-Mann's book, The Quark and the Jaguar, which is very related to symmetry and complexity. And this is all kind of in the complexity science, Santa Fe Institute. How will we actually integrate perception and relational thinking, that symmetry, into the biological symmetries we see? It's not just mirror symmetry in a face or in biological sacred geometry, body's a temple. It's not the same symmetry as the Colosseum. And so this is a pretty interesting parallel. In this book, Politics of Vision, William Blake, by Mark Schorer. Very interesting book. And it's down here on the bottom right. So what is the deal with symmetry? And why is it so important? And how is symmetry related to vision? If you look at the tet and you have Newton's sleep vision, you're asleep because of mainstream science, mainstream media, you might see one kind of symmetry on the face of the triangle. If you see a twofold, you might see different lines of symmetry. And then when you have supreme fourfold vision, what kinds of symmetries are the hidden true symmetries? And what does that have to do with synergetics? Let's keep cruising. So, one similarity for both Blake and Bucky was this idea of independence through creation. So Blake wrote these, it's called Blake's motto, at least in the complete works, it's called Blake's motto. And he wrote, I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. I will not reason and compare. My business is to create. Pretty interesting. And indeed, Blake was creative through a variety of medium. He used words, prose, cursive, writing, everything, sounds, music. He apparently played music as well, but that's not as well understood. And he used and innovated and went very, very deep and uniquely into the full page text play format. And in fact, this book, Norton Critical Edition of Blake's Poetry and Design, has some very fascinating essays that talk about how you can't just look at one of Blake's drawings and just copy the words off, because there's all these unconventional grammatical symbols and there's words that twist, and there's words where you can't just line them up in order. So he wasn't just writing out his poems, he saw actually the whole illuminated page as the art. So it's not something that you can just copy and paste out like I've done with these lines. We'll look at some of the actual texts later, the images of them, but this is extremely creative. And like Bucky, he often did these full page text plays, as well as part page text play. He did all kinds of visual media like etching, engraving, and even innovated in chemical engineering related to etching, and performed a vast number of experiments. I'm not even sure if all of his experiments with painting and drawing and etching and engraving, we may not even understand what was done in some of these very interesting cases. Then he also was an innovator and a creator in the areas of history, philosophy, theology, elocution, oration, poetry. Lot of creativity from Blake. Bucky was also independent through creation, and one of his most famous quotations is, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." So don't just deny or fight what exists. Start with what exists, build a new model, build a tool, and then things will happen that make the old model obsolete. People kind of know that, but it's really hard to put it in practice. In the case of Bucky, he had to make new paradigms, Synergetics, the geometry of thinking, what these streams are about. Project 4D time lock, whatever that is. Dymaxion, the Dymaxion map. He invented patents and unpatented inventions, maybe secret inventions. He invented words and new ways of using words. So words, clauses, sentences, he did it all. Physical tools, livingry. Bucky was really, if nothing else, invented physical things. So they both were so enthusiastic and creative. And here's a cool blog from 2019. So actually a lot of cool recent work is still happening on Blake and Bucky. So the candle is not out. Jim Carroll writes in a blog entitled, "I Must Create a System or Be Enslaved by Another Man's, The Visionary World of William Blake." He gave this quote. Cue thunderstorm in the background and, music. "These were times of radical thought and social upheaval. There were revolutions in France and America, wars raging across Europe. Blake himself was a profoundly independent spirit, a man who refused to conform to established tastes and traditions. He was deeply religious, but he objected to organized religion. He championed the imagination, but was skeptical of science. He opposed slavery, tyranny, and industrialization. He was an avid proponent of free love, and he channeled all these beliefs and opinions into his poems, print, and personal mythology." Could be Blake, could be Bucky in World War II or in the 1900s, depending on how seriously people take words such as revolution, could be now or then. So it's just so fascinating that this could have been a paragraph, but for Blake himself. Bucky himself was an independent spirit. He was. And so there was actually a contextual difference across the Atlantic, but still a way in which tumultuous times, through vision, were being yoked to creativity, systems creativity. All right. Okay. Speaking of systems creativity and building a new model to change things that you want to see changed, there's a really famous quote by Blake, and here it is in context. "With great labor," here's the page on the left. "With great labor upon his anvils, and in his ladles the ore, he lifted, pouring it into the clay ground, prepared with art, striving with systems to deliver individuals from those systems, that whenever any specter began to devour the dead, he might feel the pain as if a man gnawed his own tender nerves." So it's this middle line of this 5-line selection. And Bucky was also striving with systems to deliver individuals from those systems. There's the nation state system nexus, the grunch of giants, the scrunch of giants, as Sasha calls it. There's the system we got, Spaceship Earth. That's our system. We are striving within Spaceship Earth. Not, you can go with deliver, or you can put different words there, but we are striving with Systems Earth to make a system for every individual. And it's going to be another system. There is no non-system. Bucky was trying to work with the systems that existed to deliver individuals from the contemporary education and living standards. So he was like, wait, we have all of these factories and they're making airplanes, but then the houses are inefficient and we're not recycling the aluminum, and people are being taught about the cubes and the disinfo is everywhere. So how do we strive within that system? And okay, well, let's take the aluminum recycling and point it to the factory, and then take the factory and employ people so that they can grow, and then make houses so that they have physical support at lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy, and then they can find out better ways of recycling aluminum. We can kind of connect all the dots and live together, or we can utterly disintegrate. Together we stand, or divided we fall. A house divided cannot stand. And when I was looking around on this quote, it's just awesome about Blake that, like, every quote you look up, there will be someone who has written a thesis or some esoteric essay on it. So it's just, and there's a Blake journal. I don't think it's active anymore, but it's pretty cool. Maybe 2014 was its last year. So this is a essay by Mark Ryan, striving with systems to deliver individuals. William Blake's psychic reanimation of Greek myth, and the abstract is. The real issue at hand is whether or not there can be an individual and interior mythical vision, geometrical vision. A vision that is not simply the reflection of an ancient mythical tradition, but a new creation. A vision that reflects and unveils a new form of the cosmos and history. All of us know that the old myths are dead, but does this mean that myth itself has died? Very powerful. And the conclusion of this essay by Mark Ryan. Ask whether it could go for Blake or for Bucky. Across his works, Blake was attempting to reformulate consciousness in such a way to produce a release from delusion or restrictive reason. That is, if archetypes are taken to mean ideal forms, the like of which point towards the divine, there is the need to retrace our steps and escape the realm of the selfhood, the narrow ego that does not allow an imaginative reformation of consciousness. Newton's sleep. Blake insists upon a person throwing away his rationalistic husk in order to achieve a sense of liberation, imaginative ferment, and a chance to experience the divine within. From this perspective, divinity is equivalent to unbridled humanity and creative impulse. This actually might be a divergence between the two. Blake is all about the human energy, and energy is eternal, and everything is energy, David Tallmore, and about creativity, whereas maybe it was Bucky's slightly more formal mindset and analytical mind. He talks about doing more with less and about unbridled humanity taking care of each other, but maybe Blake too means unbridled humanity being people who forgive each other and love each other, not just people jumping for joy. Because creativity is not always jumping for joy, so I don't think Blake is just saying people will be just screaming and yelling and that's unbridled. In fact, it's really it's a sign of the times that that's to be unbridled is to lose control. So potentially in a reintegrated Albion, when all the pieces can come together in the supreme fourfold vision, maybe unbridled humanity and the creative impulse looks very different than it looks today. All right. So many fun connections. Blake wrote a little poem or a letter called To God, invoking God, geometry, and action. Bucky wrote a book and a bunch of illusions called No More Secondhand God that invoked God, geometry, and action. So there's a very famous quotation from that, which is, for God, to me, it seems, is a verb, not a noun, proper or improper. And let's remember that synergetics is a dynamic vectorial geometry. Just, keep that in mind. Here's the Blake poem To God. And here's what it looks like on the page. If you have formed a circle to go into it yourself and see how you would do. Now, here is Bucky from No More Secondhand God. Here is God's purpose. For God, to me, it seems, is a verb, not a noun, proper or improper. Is the articulation not the art, objective or subjective? Is loving not the abstraction of love, commanded or entreated? Is knowledge dynamic? Not legislative code, not proclamation law, not academic dogma, nor ecclesiastical canon. Yes, God is a verb, the most active, connoting the vast harmonic reordering of the universe from unleashed chaos of energy. And there is born unheralded a great natural peace, not out of exclusive pseudostatic security, but of including, redefining, dynamic balancing, not is lost. Only the false and non-existent are dispelled. Epic, Bucky. Thanks for that. So they both are such dynamic and passionate, personal, energetic treatises. And this is what we were almost looking at before with this unbridled humanity and its creative impulse. This is what Bucky is saying, is this unleashed chaos of energy gets harmonically reordered into a great natural peace. You get transiently stable, non-equilibrium steady states, Friston, free energy. You get non-equilibrium steady states because there's this pseudostatic, really that's a non-equilibrium steady state, I think that's what he means, of object. Objectness arises from the dynamic processes. You don't say the wood is tabling, you say it's a table. But wood is tabling because it's going to come together and go apart. And even the wood is just wooding. So everything's a process, and we use object-oriented programming and nouns to think about that. And Bucky's saying you got to think of it like a verb, but it's dynamic. It's dynamic and it has a shape, so it's dynamic vectorial geometry. And so another reading is also when Blake, even though he didn't know about synergetics probably, he says, if you have formed a circle to go into it yourself and see how you would do. It's like if you've designed a world, you figure it out, but then there's this little funny piece of a circle which doesn't exist. We know it's just like an infinitely approximation. So it's almost like if you formed a circle, like if you are without sin, if you have the infinite polygon, you have the infinite shape, then just, you got it. Good for you. But we're here with a finite. And so for those of us who have not formed a circle to go into, like God can, perhaps, how can we do? And here with the birds, really beautiful. All right. Both Blake and Bucky have the same text on the top. They focused on embodiment, perception, and the senses, and the usage of tools and media. So here's what Blake wrote. Man has no body distinct from his soul, for that called body is a portion of soul discerned by the five senses, the chief inlets of soul in this age. For Bucky, he was also very clear about this. The inlets were through sense, across the Markov interface, across the hologram. Through the interface, we get sense. That's active inference. But we can use technology and tools and media. We can use a microscope to take wavelengths of light at a size that we can't see and make it so that it projects onto our retina with photon wavelengths that we can perceive. And so we use tools to look at electromagnetic phenomena that are outside of 400 to 700 nanometers. That's what Bucky was all about, was these multiple wavelengths, and we're only seeing 0.01% of the universe. And so Blake is really saying that, yes, also, it's about coming back to the basics of sense and then thinking about how we can't escape that, but what are we going to do? How are we going to figure out the shape of things with these little five senses or fewer? And maybe they're even worse than nothing. Now, here was a part that got really interesting. This is from lightthroughmcluhan.org/senseratio.html. In the Gutenberg galaxy, Marshall McLuhan reformulates the Aristotelian Thomist concept of the sensus communis in terms of a sense ratio, a concept ostensibly adopted from William Blake. Quoting from Blake's poem Jerusalem, the emanation of the great Albion, written 1804 to 1820, McLuhan asserts that Blake is, quote, concerned with the changing patterns of human perception. He says that Blake's theme is captured in these lines from Book 2, Chapter 34 of the poem. If the perceptive organs vary, the objects of perception seem to vary. If the perceptive organs close, their objects seem to close also. This is very much related to Helmholtz and sensory physiology, inactive psychology, Friston, free energy principle, active inference, the doors of perception. That's what Blake was thinking about, was the objects and the doors of perception. He was using poetry. But it's the same insight that we have the five senses, but we're also generative modeling things that are outside of our peripersonal space. And then I thought, wait, Blake and Marshall McLuhan. I mean, if Marshall McLuhan knew Blake and thought that Blake was key, haven't Bucky and Marshall met? And in fact, they have met. Here was their first meeting. Look at these two cute guys. And here's them later in life, probably a little bit. Now, what is the story with Bucky and Marshall McLuhan? If anyone listening knows or has any insight into this media studies angle that might connect Blake, Bucky, Marshall McLuhan, probably others, I'd be super interested to hear about that. Almost dropped a 10. All right. Both Blake and Bucky highlighted accessibility of their work for children and for all kinds of learners. It's really important that we make good pedagogy, good educational material, and that we always keep accessibility and inclusion and participation in mind in our educational efforts, because it's all important. And here's pretty interesting. On the rwgrayprojects.com, where there's a ton of great Synergetics resources, there was in the preamble PDF, URL specified here, I looked at the preamble to Synergetics by E.J. Applewhite. Now, here's what E.J. writes. Perhaps the nearest thing to synergetics in its cosmological range is the work of another American poet-philosopher, the Eureka of Edgar Allan Poe, published in 1848. As Paul Valery says of Eureka, cosmogony is one of the oldest of all literary forms. As for the idea of a beginning, I mean an absolute beginning, it is necessarily a myth. I'm not suggesting that Poe had any influence on Fuller. He was only a casual reader of Poe and had never read Eureka. But both were amateurs and autodidacts, venturing into heady speculations about the nature of physical reality. So a cosmogony is like the Genesis story. And even the, quote, science one is a myth. It's a story. You can have connotations that are negative, or that's saying like we know less than we know. People can feel that way. But the point is, we don't know what happened before what we think we know when we knew it. So we don't know. And E.J. Applewhite, again, the co-author on Synergetics, second author, first author, whichever one, is contextualizing and say, actually, Synergetics is most like this work of Edgar Allan Poe's. So that's very much in line with what Kirby Erner is always talking about with Synergetics as literature tradition. Now, it's interesting because Eureka is a Genesis story, or it's a cosmological narrative. And I thought, well, actually, I don't know if Edgar Allan Poe's story, I don't know Eureka either, but could it really be as rich and multimedia as Blake? I don't think so. And then I thought, I wonder if E.J. Applewhite knew about Blake. And then he continues in the preamble. What Bucky shares with Poe is a fierce conviction in the inevitability of his description of the cosmos. The Tet will win. It will win. On the opening page of Synergetics, Fuller exhorts the reader, dare to be naive. Similarly, in speaking, he tended to address professors as if they were 9-year-olds, and 9-year-olds as if they were professors. This is a strategy that was anticipated by William Blake, who liked to think that his works were perfectly comprehensible to the innocent, to minds not blunted by education and fashion, especially children. E.J. Applewhite, Jan, 1986. So, this is so true about William Blake. His book, Songs of Innocence and Experience, which he evolved over his whole life. There's so many other works about the mind of a child, and it's just really interesting that Blake and Fuller, adults get mad when they think they're being talked to like children, but it turns out that children love it when they're actually allowed to act like adults. And so both Blake and Bucky had such resonance on that issue. And then it seems like EJ does know about Blake, but I'm not sure if EJ Applewhite was aware of the depth of Blake's project. Because if the only thing that Eureka has going for it is that it's cosmological, then I think that Blake would be about 4 orders of magnitude more. Now, also, I'm just more generally curious about E.J. Applewhite. So if anyone listening to this could help me understand, either privately or publicly, a little bit more about E.J. Applewhite, I would actually appreciate that. Here's another topic where there was a resonance. They both were critics, but also visionaries about the relationship between humans, technology, and ecology. So in the case of Bucky, we think about this in everything he does, but specifically the grunge of giants, aka the scrunch of giants, the difference between weaponry versus livingry. So he was seeing these aluminum factories pump out bullets, and he thought, couldn't we just make the houses that people are kind of fighting over with this high precision, high efficiency engineering? And about doing more with less. So yeah, there's pesticides and there's toxins, and it's really tragic in many cases. How are we going to recycle, reduce, renew, reuse, and do more with less for everybody in the future? We can't just say, la, 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 it's not happening. We have to recycle. Now, the lead in the water, maybe that's the most valuable thing. Maybe we'll be able to use lead for new types of things, or when we concentrate it, it's better for everybody. But we can't do less with more dispersal. We need to be doing more with less. And so here is a poem by Blake with another famous line or two. Blake writes, "And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountain green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills?" So the satanic mills were these dark, bellowing and belching industrial furnaces that this phrase has really captured the imagination of many. And this is referencing in an allegorical or real, what is real, what's instrumental, not for today, not really a big deal. He looks out over these hills, and they used to be the most pleasant green pastures, England's mountain green. And he's asking, was Jerusalem builded here? The Holy Lamb of God is a Christ allusion. So was Jerusalem, the promised land, here in ancient time? Was it when it was green and the lamb could be on the pasture? And then now the lamb is gone. Maybe the lamb has been sacrificed. And all there is the satanic mills. So what would that mean? And this is also related to some of Blake's alternate or real histories about who the Druids were and about what the history of the world was. And Bucky also had his own alternate stories about Christ and the Middle East and Britain and people. Both Blake and Bucky were way ahead of the curve on the flat earth versus ball earth debate. Now, I know on YouTube or whatever, I don't know, I'm not going to go into the flat versus ball earth. I would love to hear people's perspective on this issue, especially if it could be framed in relationship to Synergetics or William Blake. But Bucky made the Dymaxion map. It's what I have above me, and I think that it'd be interesting to hear from some people who have studied the flat earth question to learn about what they think about the Dymaxion map. I'm just curious. I've never heard it, but haven't looked that much. Now, Blake, this is worth going into and relating it to a few other fun ideas. Blake, in several passages, refers to the flat earth becoming a ball as a delusion of the modern scientific spirit. So here's in Milton. And I'll read it and connect it to these red Buckyisms on the right side. So, the sky is an immortal tent built by the sons of Los, and every space that a man views around his dwelling place, standing on his own roof or in his garden on a mount, of 25 cubit in height, such space is his universe. So that's system. It's your peripersonal space. It's almost like what our local sense making is. Cosmic fishing. We're in the cosmos, we're local. We're hyperlocal. There's the ocean and we're fishing in it. So we're hyperlocal. We're at the intersection of all these omnisymmetrical bubbles that are expanding and all this interesting stuff according to Bucky. But what it comes down to is the field of affordances, the semantic field, the peripersonal space of our experience. That's locally accessible. So maybe I can see on my screen a chat message from somebody who's living in a different part of the world, but it's my peripersonal space because it's sense. And on its verge, the sun rises and sets. The clouds bow to meet the flat earth and the sea in such an ordered space. So that's talking about the horizon in the sky. And Bucky, of course, didn't go for sunrise, sunset, and people have many thoughts on earth eclipse, earthrise, and whatever you want to call the way that it gets light and dark and what it looks like at that time. But the point is that our peripersonal space is actually ambiguous whether the big system is flat or round, right? Which is why there's people who look around and they see flat. There's other people who look around and they kind of implicitly imagine that it curves off around them. And that's just related to our peripersonal space not having the information in most situations to resolve that uncertainty. So take it back to Bucky. The Greek looked at the local flatness of the plane and said, well, actually, by having this piece of paper that's open-ended, we'll be able to model it just like it was a big plane, you know, a plane on a piece of paper. But of course, it wasn't a piece of paper. It actually has a spherical curvature. And any spherical curvature, no matter how slight, means that two lines that are locally parallel are actually never actually parallel. They will intersect. So this is where we get non-Euclidean geometry and its relationship to flat Earth. The starry heavens reach no further. So basically, perceiving things as flat Earth is like perceiving Newton's single vision. It's like being asleep. And I don't want to come down too hard on either side of this issue. I'm just mapping it out. But seeing it synergetically is understanding that even if there's local dips and parts where it's like dips in or whatever, or there's some local irregularities, we're talking about a shape that does come back on itself. That's really the debate. I don't know what shape it is either exactly. On all sides, and the two poles turn on their valves of gold. And if he moves his dwelling place, his heavens also move. So this is kind of like a valediction forbidding morning by John Donne. It's like this golden axis. And whenever we move, the heavens move around us. It's egocentric navigation. Where he goes, and all his neighborhood bewail his loss. So it's a loss for them, but the person actually takes their neighborhood with them because their perception, their peripersonal space is taken with them. Such are the spaces called earth, and such its dimension, such and such. As to that false appearance which appears to be the reasoner, as of a globe rolling through voidness, it is a delusion of Ulro. So here's where Bucky and Blake agree. Earth has a shape, space has a shape, and observers can be deluded. It's up to the listener whether the delusion is the globe rolling through voidness or not. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. But the point is, people can be deluded, and the question is, given our peripersonal space, how are we going to make the right inference about what is real? Because we're on our ship. Are we expecting to hit an ice wall? To fall off a cliff? To reach back around? Does it depend on which way we go? We need to know because we need to steer the ship further than we can see. So we can make some tools like a telescope to help us look a little further, but at some point we actually need to have a generative model of what's even further, especially if it's not within the visible range, even with technology. The microscope knows not of this, nor the telescope. They alter the ratio of the spectator's organs, but leave objects untouched. This is so synergetic. Ratio or angle are metaphysical, but shape is metaphysical. Triangle is metaphysical. There is no triangle in real life. There's three things that if you abstract it or generalize it, it would be like a triangle, but ratio or angle, or the idea of three things being related, is in the mind. For every space larger than a red globule of man's blood is visionary. Now, let's close the loop with Friston. Blake is saying everything bigger than a red blood cell is doing inference on the shape of things in the bigger world through sense and action. So it's kind of like, if you want to be active, it's almost like saying if you're smaller than a cell, you don't have an enclosure. So every globule, every enclosed space, internal states, Markov blanket, generative model, active inference, every enclosed system, fourfold system, is doing inference on the shape of things, the shape of regularities out there. And that is being done with sense and action in the active inference framework. So bringing that projective geometric perspective of active inference to the peripersonal ambiguity of whether we're in a flat or a ball earth, just Blake and Fuller were way ahead of their time on that area. Here's the last message for this section. The final message on Blake's stone is reading. I give you the end of a golden string. Only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall. And Bucky, of course, famously just has on his gravestone, call me Trim Tap. So two really amazing lives, and pretty fun to make this comparison. And I think it'd be awesome to hear from anyone else on their perspective. What else would they have added? Do they have any questions? How can we build on this and strengthen this connection? I didn't see too much on geodesics and William Blake, for example. So could that be an area of exciting research? So if anyone has just info they'd like to provide, questions, which are types of information as well, that would be epic. So let's close it out. That was Synergetics live stream number 6. And we thought about history, mindfulness, future. I hope we did. And it was a pretty interesting discussion. We talked about, in part 1, Bucky and Wittgenstein and the ants, and about the trims and the normals from Kirby Erner. We talked about Professor Gordon's essay on Wittgenstein and ant watching, and Timosheev's work on complexity science. We then jumped into part 2 with William Blake, went through their life, understanding of science, fourfoldness, symmetries, independence through creation, delivering systems, individuals from systems with his systems, oblique understandings of spirituality and God, embodiment, perception, accessibility, and participation, flat versus ball earth, cool gravestones, great times. So thanks everyone for watching. Hope all is well with you. And yep, just always appreciate it when people leave comments or just let me know their thoughts on these discussions. So I hope to hear from you or see you in a future Synergetics live stream. Bye.